I want to welcome everyone who is taking Thesis Seminar this semester. We just completed our first week of class, and I wanted to provide kind of an overview, a summary of what we tried to achieve this first week, and now looking into week 2, what we can expect going forward. So just to review, remember we're going to be looking at our Thesis Seminar course in Google Classroom. Much of what we discuss and talk about in our weekly sessions, I'm going to provide information or content online in Google Classroom for you to access. Also, there'll be a few assignments throughout the semester that will also reside here in this space. So if you haven't already, make sure that you've joined Google Classroom. And if for some reason you still need the class code, feel free to either come by my office or send me an email, and I'll be happy to provide that to you. Remember that Google Classroom is set up into 3 different sections. Okay, so this is going to look very similar to the app that you have installed on your cell phone. The stream is where I'll post different messages that I want to send out to everyone. Also, sometimes I come across articles that I know some of you are interested in, some topics that I know that you're researching, and I may, from time to time, share those with you here in the stream. You can also ask questions here, but know that this is a public space, public in the sense that all of you who are signed up taking the course and have enrolled into this course will be able to see any of the comments that appear in the stream. This is not shared to the outside world, other than obviously now when I'm showing and broadcasting this. But this is a closed classroom, so no one else other than those who have signed up, those of you who have the class code, will be able to access this information. The second section, the classwork section, is where all the content will reside, and I'll break down the content into weeks, and each section or each week will have a title along with different content and or assignments that are to be included in that particular week. So the first week we looked at a newsletter, and the newsletter outlined different things that we looked at and talked about in week 1. And also you were asked to start a document using a template, a thesis seminar template, and those documents can be found here. Okay, we also talked about our weekly journal, so if you haven't already, please try to complete the weekly journal and try to provide as much reflection as possible, taking into consideration the different questions that I pose for you to consider. Remember, this is to help me see where you're at in the process. If you're having some challenges, I'd like to know about those. Also, you have an opportunity through these weekly journals to ask me or actually articulate what you need from me in the upcoming tutoring session. So try to provide a lot of good information about how you're coming along so that we can maintain good communication throughout the semester, and I can again give you the support that you need week to week. All right, so this is week 1, and week 2 I have a second lecture that I'd like to talk briefly about, kind of give you an overview about what to expect for week 2, for this upcoming week. In week 1, we spent a lot of time trying to narrow down our topic, really thinking in terms of a clear problem and a researchable problem, one that's specific enough so that that you can really provide have a reason for doing your research. Remember that the problem should not only be something that you relate to that is of interest to you, but also a problem that others have researched. So if you're looking at a problem that you have faced either as a teacher and or as a learner, it's really important to make sure that, if you haven't already, make sure that in your introduction or in your lit review at some point that you articulate, that you communicate what that problem is, so that the problem is not just from your own opinion, your own perspective, that it's actually based in research. So we need to look at certain research questions. Most of you are doing qualitative research. So I'm going to be talking in terms of research questions, not so much as a hypothesis. Again, just simply because most of you will not be doing quantitative research. You'll be doing qualitative research. Some of you may be doing mixed methods, which would include descriptive statistics, but for the most part, I won't be talking in terms of hypothesis. I'll be referring to your research questions. And so at this point, as you start looking at your literature review that many of you have completed last week, some of you are creating literature reviews from scratch, but I think it's important to realize early on the importance of organizing your ideas and creating sections that will provide the overall argument that support these research questions. Remember that the research questions are not only for you, the researcher, but in your literature review, try to create an argument that addresses the research questions. Try to find research that answers your research questions. So I think it's not too early to write out maybe at the end of your literature review, even though maybe you have not completed the transitional paragraph that we talked about last week, but go ahead and share what your research questions are, even if they're still undergoing some changes and maybe you're not 100% sure what those research questions are going to be. Go ahead and write out those research questions so that this will help kind of see how, what purpose and where you're going with the research. So I was looking at some of the reflections from last week, and again, if you have not done so already, please go ahead and upload those to Google Classroom. But there are basically 4 questions that many of you are considering, which is absolutely normal at this point in the research/writing process. The first question, is it convenient to have a mixed methods according to what I want to research? So a lot of you are considering the different types of research designs. Maybe you're not 100% sure which design is the best. We can certainly talk about those options that you have. Another question, is the information obtained convenient for my study? So is the information in my current literature review appropriate for the study that I want to do? So many of us will be discussing this as well as I look at your literature review, preferably now in Google Docs within Classroom. And again, if you have not done so, please do that as soon as possible. Even if you're not complete, or if you're not finished, or if you still anticipate a lot of changes, that's fine. Whatever you have, please upload that information. The third question, is the organization of the literature review appropriate? So this is precisely what I'd like to talk about this week and what I want to talk about here a few minutes in this video, which I'll get to in a few minutes. And the last question, what kind of information can I add to complement the literature review? So if there's anything missing, what else needs to be added? So I think these are very good reflective questions at this point in the research process. And this is what I'd like to kind of address very briefly here in this video. Again, just kind of setting up the idea for this week, as then later on we'll have one-on-one sessions to get into the specifics. So when you draft a literature review for your researchable topic or your researchable problem, again, the research questions are the main focus. This is going to be the main idea. And as I mentioned earlier this week, I think 1 to 3 research questions for the purposes of our context is a pretty good number. I would rather you have less questions and you really dig deep into those questions and address and answer those questions than to have too many questions and not really get around to answering all those. Remember that the research questions need to be answered both in the literature review and in your own research at the end in the results and discussion section. So it really doesn't do you much good to have so many research questions that you really don't get to them all. Again, given the restrictions and the limitations we have trying to do this whole research project in one semester, one 16-week course. Remember that you have 3 weeks to collect data, and again, this is kind of the the boundaries. Whenever I look at a research question, I ask myself, well, can this learner collect the data within 3 weeks to really address these questions? And I think you would benefit from considering those same questions, right? Because you need to be able to think about, what type of data are you going to collect, and how long are you going to have to collect the data? What schools and institutions are you going to go to and collect that data? All of these considerations come into play. And again, we're only going to have 3 weeks to collect this data. So I'm going to give you an example here, something that I was thinking about. And I want to kind of go over the process of how I am thinking about possibly organizing my ideas around this one question in terms of a future literature review. So my example research question is as follows. How can cell phones be used to promote communicative strategies and collaboration in the English language learning classroom? Now, I mentioned that many of you are going to have anywhere from 1 to 3 research questions. For the sake of this example, I'm only going to include one question, but again, you could have a couple of related questions or perhaps even more slightly specific questions that relate to this broader question. But let's look at this one question here. And I've got a list or a series of additional questions that I want to go over. Now, it's important to note at this point that the questions that I'm going to talk about here that I have highlighted here in this list are not research questions. These are just now questions that I'm posing in terms of a section or some ideas that I can turn in and develop as individual sections throughout my literature review. So here are a few of the questions here. And actually the first one is not a question. I think I must have cut it off here. But cell phone usage past to the present. So this first idea here is thinking about maybe introducing this idea of mobile technologies or cell phones in particular, and provide a little bit of context as to how phones were used in the past versus how they're used now. This one section that might begin my literature review would be organized chronologically. So if you have research, and you can find some research on cell phones in the classroom, and it provides some sort of historical context, this might be a good option, a good way to start the first section of your literature review. The next section here, which is a question, how can the zone of proximal development apply to peer interaction and assessment? So there are two aspects of this research question. One is promote communicative strategies, and then the second is collaboration. So as I look at these two sections, I basically have to think about how can I develop this idea of communicative strategies and this idea of collaboration in my literature review. And as I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking out loud and I'm sharing my ideas with you at this point. One idea here is, well, at what point do I bring up communicative strategies? Now, in my question, I may want later on, I may want to change the order and put collaboration before communicative strategies, because maybe that is how I want to present my ideas in my literature review. But let's say now that I want to talk about collaboration first, and I want to bring up this idea of zone of proximal development, Vygotsky, and I want to talk about mediation maybe, and bring in some social cultural theory into my literature review. Well, maybe I want to present that first. Again, kind of thinking of it more theoretical, and talking about interaction between learners. Because eventually I want to talk about students maybe conversing, interacting amongst themselves using their cell phones. So I start by talking about cell phone usage first. Then I start thinking about social cultural theory, or more specifically, the zone of proximal development, talking about interaction and assessment. And then I lead into what are some various interactional patterns in the classroom. Maybe I have a section now that goes into some some studies that support working individually, working in pairs, working in small groups, mixed abilities groups, the more advanced students working with lower levels, maybe even some groups that are more or less the same level, the benefits, the drawbacks, different perspectives. What do the experts say about interactional patterns within the classroom? And moving on, the next question is, what is the difference between collaboration and cooperation? So this is kind of a specific question that I want to remind myself that I need to develop and make sure that I'm clear on, so I don't mix the terms collaboration and cooperation, that I choose one, in this case collaboration, but I also want to distinguish it between cooperation and what experts say those two terms mean specifically in an educational context. Then the last question, what are some communicative strategies? And or maybe a related question, how does one continue a conversation when he or she is not sure what to say? So this is an idea here of coming up with some questions. Now, my next step, and I think that's what I started to do with this first item here, is I'll want to turn these questions into affirmations, or I want to turn these into declarative sentences or ideas about how I want to create subheadings for my literature review. Remember that probably 2 to 4 subheadings will be sufficient for the length of this literature review, which will be approximately 2,250 words. So again, 2 to 4 sections is, I think, adequate. So I may look at the topics here that I have. I may still need to change the order, change it around a little bit, but I have to think about which of the 2 to 4 sections that will make up my subheadings in my literature review. I would suggest that you look at your literature review and go ahead and write out and provide the 2 to 4 headings in your literature review. Now, all of you started with a template, and I hope that you keep this template and only go in and add information to each of the respective sections, because many of the headings I provided for you according to APA. If you go to the main section here, this is where your literature review is going to begin, where it says title of your work. You're not going to have a heading that's called introduction, even though you will have an introduction. It's not necessary to have a title called introduction. So you're going to have the title of your work here, and you can add this later, certainly, if you don't have it now. You'll have your first paragraph will serve as your introduction, and then your first heading here is where your literature review is going to begin. So for this week, week 2, you're basically going to start right here. We're going to have time later on to deal with the introduction. I may ask you this week to write out your thesis statement, which will appear in your introduction, which you can put as one sentence here in this space, right before your first heading, or your first subheading. That might help us kind of see what the objective is of your study, what the main claim is that you want to pose for your research. But this is where you're going to have your 2 to 4 sections, okay? These are called level 2 headings. This is a level 1. And this is a level 3. So you're going to need 2 to 4 level 2 headings, anywhere from 2 to 4. And if you have only 2 headings, for example, you may have or even need a level 3 heading. If you have 4 headings, 4 level 2 headings like this, you're probably not going to need a level 3 heading. I'll help you with that. We'll talk about that as you develop your lit review. But keep in mind the importance of headings. A heading provides an outline. It's kind of a roadmap, if you will. And it's really important to maintain good structure, good organization, and you can do that by being very careful and being very deliberate with your headings. It's a good idea to have headings between 6 to 12 words. You don't want to have headings with like one word or probably not even 2 words. But I would say 6 to 12 words is a pretty good tip, I think, a suggestion for level 2 headings and level 1 headings. Maybe level 3 headings tend to be a little bit less, a little bit shorter, perhaps. But we can certainly look at that and discuss that. But this is where you're going to need to include your literature review for this week. Again, it's going to be before the method section, and it's going to begin after the introduction paragraph. Again, I'm selecting the area here where your literature review is going to be. Go ahead and copy and paste over whatever you've had in the past, and make any kind of notations that you need to yourself as needed. Use the note feature on the right-hand side of Google Docs if you need to. Feel free to ask me questions if there are certain parts of your literature review that you want to select, and then add a comment. Again, it's as easy as selecting the text, right-clicking, and then clicking comment, right? And then it shows up there. And it's always a good idea when you finish with certain comments to resolve them so that Google Docs will keep a history of those comments and we can refer back to those if needed. Don't worry about the rest of the sections for now, but this will be where you develop your method and your results and discussion section. Do worry about your references. Now notice here I have some examples. I left some examples here so that you can see how they are listed based on APA. So use this as a guide only to see what text is italicized, spacing, punctuation, capitalization, all of those details that we've talked about in prior classes. I tried to provide an example here for you to use as a guide. So take a look at the references that maybe you have already. Bring them on over as you develop your literature review. Very important that as you develop your literature review that you have your references. I tend not to look too closely at a literature review unless you also have references as you're developing and writing your lit review. So try to get in the habit of including the references as you go along. We'll talk later about appendix and appendices here at the end of your document. For now, the literature review is going to be our goal, and I wanted to show you what I mean by the different headings and how you can organize your sections, again, based on some key research questions. So one last thing I want to say about the template. Again, it's going to be very helpful if you can include a thesis statement here at the end of your introduction. And right at the end of your literature review, go ahead and list out 1 to 3 research questions that you're considering. I'm going to look at your research questions and your thesis statement and then how you organize your literature review. And I think that will help us kind of align all of these 3 very important parts to your thesis paper. Okay. So, the research questions, organizing your literature review. We're going to talk this week about your thesis statement, claims, premises, grounds, evidence, and warrant. These are key terms here that we're going to be talking about in terms of your literature review and how you organize your ideas. But basically, claims are going to be types of sentences that you're going to include. For example, your thesis statement is your overall claim. This is your assertion. This is what your opinion essentially about what you're trying to basically prove or what you're trying to answer. So your thesis statement should align with the main sections to your literature review. The main sections should align with the topic sentences, which are also claims. And then within each body paragraph, your supporting sentences or your details should align with your topic sentences. So all of those should align with each other, and we'll talk more this week about claims and premises. And we've already talked about grounds. If we recall, we talked about the meal plan, the acronym MEAL, M-E-A-L, as meaning main idea, evidence, analyze, and link. So the evidence are basically the grounds. These are the claims that support your ideas. And then the warrants are your explanations. It's basically how you explain or comment on the grounds, how they relate back to the topic sentence. So take a look at this. There's a lot of information here, but I think it's important. And as you put your ideas together, we'll be talking and clarifying any of this information that's necessary. If you have some doubts, we can work those out in our tutoring sessions. But I wanted to give you kind of a heads up as to what we're going to focus on this week. Again, it's going to be organizing. We're going to be focusing on having good research questions and a thesis statement, and then looking at the specifics of how we can align your literature review. Hopefully answering some of these questions about, well, do I need more information? What do I have currently that will help me in doing my research? And perhaps what do I still need to add and read about and maybe modify to make sure that my literature review aligns with my research. So, I hope this helps. Again, if you have any issues about getting into Thesis Seminar, into the Google Classroom, let me know. There are basically 3 mobile apps that I suggest that you install, one being the Google Classroom. Second app I would suggest that you install is Google Docs. And the third, Google Drive. I think those 3 apps on your phone will help you not only access the information that I'm sharing in Google Classroom, but also if you would like, you can work and input and actually create some of the content using your phones. Probably not the most comfortable and most productive way of working. Many of you will choose probably to find some computer someplace to write up some of your text. But certainly if you're out and about and you need to upload your reflection, you might want to do that using your cell phone, and I certainly want to give you that option if you wish. Again, most of the information here, don't feel overwhelmed. If you feel like there's a lot here to cover and you're not able to cover all of it, don't get stressed. I try to provide this information as an option, as a complement of what we're doing, again, face-to-face, and what you're doing on your own in your own research. There are homework assignments that need to be completed, and again, I'm going to organize those by week. And anytime you see a due date, then you know that there's an assignment that you're going to receive a grade for that. So the newsletter, for example, is not for a grade. This is just material. Same way for week 2. We have the literature review newsletter here. There's no due date. It is under week 2, but it's not for a grade. It's just for you to review and hopefully will orient you to what we're doing for that given week. And probably in a few days, I'll upload the next weekly journal here under week 2. You can expect that. But again, all of this information you can access from your cell phone. Any issues that you have with technology, don't hesitate to come by my office. I know at the beginning of each class it can get a little, maybe a little bit confusing, and maybe it's something new. But the idea is that we get into a flow, making sure that I'm as accessible as possible, that I'm able to reach out and provide assistance when you need it. And I think using Google Classroom is a good way to do that. Remember that if you want to send me a private email, you can certainly do that. I'm not going to click on this now, but if you go under People, you should be able to access my email and send me a direct private email if you need to. Of course, you can always send messages, even requests through the stream as well, but everyone else in the classroom can see it. Again, no one else, the public is not able to see it, only those who are signed up for Thesis Seminar in Google Classroom. Okay, guys, I'll conclude with this, and I look forward to seeing everyone this week in week 2 and helping you with organizing your ideas for your literature review.